Welcome to the deep dive. Whether you're prepping for a meeting or trying to catch up on ancient history, or maybe you're just, deeply curious about how human societies organize themselves, we are just thrilled to have you with us today.
Yeah, we really are. And our goal is to just dive into the research, respect your time, and pull out those insights that, fundamentally change how you view the past.
Exactly. And for today's exploration, we have this incredible stack of sources in front of us. We are looking at comprehensive historical, archaeological, and encyclopedic records concerning the Maurya Empire.
Right, which is just a massive topic.
It really is. We're talking about a civilization that thrived from roughly 321 to 185 BCE across South Asia. And it features some of the most famous and honestly heavily debated rulers in human history, like Chandragupta and Ashoka.
Yeah, and to get a picture of them, we're pulling from surviving fragments of Megasthenes, who was a Greek ambassador living right there in the Mauryan capital.
Plus, we're examining those famous rock-cut edicts of Ashoka and looking at the whole archaeological footprint of the era.
Right. And the source material for this period it's a fascinating puzzle because it really forces us to reconcile physical evidence with, well, highly idealized texts.
Which is always tricky.
Oh, totally. We have to navigate between the stone-carved propaganda of emperors, the observations of foreign diplomats, and then, the vast archaeological record left behind by just ordinary citizens.
Right. And our mission for this deep dive is to deconstruct how one of the ancient world's largest empires actually functioned on a day-to-day basis. We really want to dismantle that popular myth of ancient empires operating as these giant, solid, monolithic blocks of controlled territory.
Because they really weren't. It was actually a highly complex network of trade, sprawling bureaucracy, espionage, and some pretty radical religious transformations.
Yeah, we're going to look at everything from exchanging 500 war elephants for vast tracts of modern Afghanistan to diplomatic letters requesting Greek philosophers.
And even the intricate economics behind what might be the world's first state-sponsored environmental conservation laws.
It's going to be a wild ride. So, I want to start by talking about how we visualize history. Usually when we look at a historical map of the ancient world, there's this expectation of cartographic precision.
Right, the old coloring book model.
Exactly. You open a textbook, you look at a map of a famous empire,
Right.
and you see this giant solid block of color just stretching across a continent. And it implies this binary reality, right? You are either inside the empire, subject to its laws and taxes, or you are outside of it.
Yeah, it's clean, it's comforting, and it gives us the illusion that ancient borders functioned exactly like modern nation-states.
But that coloring book model is incredibly pervasive. We naturally want to categorize things with firm, visible boundaries.
But when you actually step into the reality of ancient South Asia and the Maurya Empire, that paradigm completely falls apart. The geopolitical landscape was not a solid block of color at all.
Right. It was highly porous, fluid, and heavily dependent on geographic realities.
Exactly. We are dealing with cartographic muddy waters where the reach of the state was incredibly strong in the cities and along the highways, but virtually non-existent in the dense forests sitting just a few miles away.
Right, which is just wild to think about. But before a state can even begin to grapple with those geographic realities, it has to be forged in the first place.
And it didn't emerge in a vacuum.
No, not at all. The Maurya dynasty rose out of the chaotic, fractured landscape left behind by a very specific historical trauma. So to understand the rise of Chandragupta Maurya, we really have to look at the immediate aftermath of Alexander the Great's campaigns in India.
Right. The geopolitical stage was basically set by this massive destabilization event. By 326 BCE, Alexander the Great had pushed his campaigns deep into the northwestern part of the Indian subcontinent.
Venturing right into the Punjab region.
Exactly. And he had just fought this absolute grueling battle against King Porus at the Hydaspes River. But when Alexander ordered his army to push further east toward the Ganges plain, his troops mutinied.
Right at the Bees River. And the accounts of this mutiny always strike me as this profound collision between imperial ambition and just human endurance.
Yeah, his men had been marching and fighting for nearly a decade.
A decade. And the intelligence they were getting from the east suggested that the Nanda Empire, which was the dominant power in the Ganges basin at the time, was waiting for them with an army of hundreds of thousands of infantry.
And crucially, thousands of war elephants.
Right. The Greeks had barely survived fighting a couple of hundred elephants against Porus. The idea of facing thousands. They simply refused to take another step forward.
It was a complete logistical and psychological breaking point. Alexander was forced to yield to his men. So he turned back, redeployed his forces down the Indus River, and eventually headed back toward Babylon.
And when Alexander died shortly after in 323 BCE, his massive empire immediately fractured.
Right, his generals just started fighting over the territories, which is a period we call the Wars of the Diadochi.
And in the Indian provinces, this infighting, plus the withdrawal of troops, it left a massive structural void in the regional power dynamics. The local leaders and republics that Alexander had subjugated were suddenly left loosely supervised by these weakened Greek governors.
And stepping right into that void is Chandragupta Maurya.
Yes, and the origins of Chandragupta are highly debated and, honestly, heavily mythologized. If we look at the Buddhist texts, they claim he belonged to a clan called the Mauryas.
Right, a kshatriya or warrior clan whose name is associated with peacocks.
But then you have Jain texts stating he was the grandson of a village chief who worked as an imperial superintendent of peacocks.
The recurring motif of the peacock is really one of the few consistencies across these disparate sources, and archaeologically, this connection actually holds weight.
Oh, really? How so?
Well, when you examine the pillars erected later by his grandson Ashoka, like the one at Nandangar, or the intricate sculptures on the Great Stupa at Sanchi, you frequently find peacock figures integrated into the design.
Ah, so it strongly suggests the peacock was indeed the dynastic emblem.
Exactly. Which gives some credence to the Maurya clan origin story over the later, more derogatory claims by some Brahmanical texts that said he was of, low-caste, mysterious origins.
Okay, so he had this young figure from the Maurya clan, and the trajectory of his life is entirely altered by his partnership with a brilliant, highly vengeful minister named Chanakya.
Yes, Chanakya.
The historical tradition paints Chanakya as a master strategist who was previously working in Pataliputra, the massive capital city of the Nanda Empire. And the Nanda king, Dhanananda, was famously wealthy, but deeply unpopular.
Because he heavily taxed the population to build that massive elephant-heavy military that had just terrified Alexander's men.
Exactly. So according to the narrative, Chanakya attempted to advise Dhanananda, maybe warning him of the impending foreign threats, but he was publicly insulted and humiliated by the king.
Right. So Chanakya fled the capital, swearing revenge against the entire Nanda dynasty, and made his way to Taxila.
And Taxila is a crucial location here, right?
Oh, absolutely. It wasn't just a random city. It was one of the greatest centers of learning and trade in the ancient world. It's located in the northwest, right in the corridor where Indian, Persian, and Hellenistic cultures collided.
So Chanakya was operating in an environment steeped in political philosophy, military strategy, and active resistance to the recent Macedonian occupation.
Exactly. And the story goes that while traveling through the Vindhya forest, Chanakya stumbled across some young men playing a rural game that involved a mock court and a pitched battle.
And one of those boys, acting as the king, was Chandragupta.
Right. Chanakya supposedly observed the boy's natural authority, took him under his wing, and brought him back to Taxila for intense training in the military and political arts.
Basically grooming him to overthrow Dhanananda.
Yes. And once trained, they began recruiting an army. But they didn't start with a massive centralized force. They recruited from the local military republics in the Punjab.
Groups like the Adhyas, who had fiercely resisted Alexander's initial invasion.
Yeah. They built a coalition of mercenaries, local tribes, and disgruntled factions.
But when we look at how the actual conquest of the Nanda Empire played out, the sources diverge wildly, don't they?
They really do. The Buddhist accounts portray the campaign as this relatively smooth, almost predestined victory for Chandragupta.
But the Hindu and Jain texts paint a much darker picture of a bitter, protracted, and highly tactical war.
Yeah, the disparity likely comes down to the religious affiliations of the later writers and how they wanted to portray the founding of the dynasty. But from a military logistics standpoint, the Jain and Hindu accounts of a protracted struggle are far more plausible.
Because the Nanda army was a formidable, entrenched force.
Exactly. The sources actually indicate that Chandragupta and Chanakya failed disastrously in their first attempt to strike directly at the Nanda capital of Pataliputra.
They realized they couldn't just decapitate the empire.
Right. They had to change tactics. They adopted a strategy of systematic frontier erosion, conquering the peripheral territories first, establishing garrisons, securing supply lines, and slowly cutting off the capital's resources.
Before finally laying a successful siege to Pataliputra and forcing Dhanananda into exile.
Exactly.
We also have Western sources weighing in on this rise to power, which is fascinating. The Roman historian Justin, who was compiling earlier Greek accounts, adds a layer of divine destiny to the narrative.
Oh, right. The elephant story.
Yes. Justin claims that as Chandragupta was organizing his rebel forces, a massive wild elephant approached him, acted completely tame, and allowed Chandragupta to ride it, signaling to his followers that he was a destined war leader.
It's a great piece of mythology.
But Justin doesn't just offer mythology. He offers a surprisingly cynical political analysis, too. He explicitly writes that Chandragupta was the author of the liberation of India from the Greek prefects left behind by Alexander, but that after his victory, Chandragupta transformed that liberation into servitude.
Right, that once on the throne, Chandragupta oppressed the very people he had mobilized for freedom.
When I read that, it sounds remarkably familiar. It paints Chandragupta as an ancient populist, like a revolutionary who uses the rhetoric of liberation and grassroots militias to overthrow the oppressive Nanda regime. But the moment he secures power, he simply installs himself as a new, highly centralized dictator.
Yeah, utilizing the exact same coercive mechanisms he'd just fought against.
Exactly.
And that cycle of liberation turning into authoritarian consolidation, I mean, that is a cornerstone of state formation.
It makes sense.
It does. Because the organizational structures required to overthrow an established empire, ruthless military discipline, resource extraction to pay mercenaries, a unified command structure, those are the exact tools needed to build an autocracy.
Chandragupta mobilized the periphery against the center, but once he occupied the center, his priority shifted to absolute control.
He needed to extract taxes to maintain his new army, which, to the average peasant, probably felt remarkably similar to the oppression of the Nanda kings.
I'm sure it did. And the true test of that newly consolidated power came in 303 BCE. Over in the west, Alexander's former general, Seleucus Nicator, had secured control over the Asian portion of the Macedonian Empire, establishing the Seleucid Empire.
And Seleucus wanted to reclaim the Indian territories Alexander had briefly held.
Right. So he marched an army across the Indus River, intending to reassert Greek dominance. But he ran straight into Chandragupta's fully mobilized Mauryan army.
And instead of a catastrophic, mutually destructive war, the two leaders arrived at a highly pragmatic diplomatic resolution.
Which is pretty rare in ancient history.
Very rare. They formed a dynastic marriage alliance, and Seleucus formally transferred massive western territories to Chandragupta.
The scale of that territorial transfer is just staggering.
Yeah.
We're talking about the easternmost satrapies of the Seleucid Empire.
Right, and a satrapy was essentially a massive administrative province governed by a royally appointed official. Seleucus handed over the satrapies covering modern-day Gandhara, Kandahar in Afghanistan, parts of Balochistan, and the Makran coast.
It pushed the borders of the Maurya Empire deep into the Iranian plateau.
Exactly.
But to give up that much strategic territory, Seleucus must have received something of immense value in return. The sources say Chandragupta gave him 500 war elephants. Now, to modern ears, trading half of modern Afghanistan for 500 animals sounds completely absurd. Why would a Hellenistic king make that trade?
Because in the context of ancient warfare, 500 fully trained Indian war elephants were the equivalent of a modern armored division.
Wow, an armored division.
Yeah, they were the ultimate shock weapon. Elephants could break infantry formations, they could terrify cavalry because horses naturally panic at the smell and sight of elephants, and they serve as mobile platforms for archers.
That makes a lot of sense.
And Seleucus was locked in this brutal existential war with the other successors of Alexander in the Mediterranean. He didn't need vast, difficult-to-govern territories in the Hindu Kush Mountains. He needed immediate, overwhelming tactical superiority on the battlefield.
And that trade paid off perfectly for him, right?
It did. Seleucus marched those 500 Mauryan elephants thousands of miles west, and they were the decisive factor in his victory at the massive Battle of Ipsus in 301 BCE. That battle permanently fractured the empire of his rival Antigonus.
It is just a phenomenal example of ancient globalization. A treaty negotiated on the banks of the Indus River directly dictated the political borders of the Mediterranean world.
Yeah, it really is.
And the relationship between the Mauryas and the Seleucids remains surprisingly close. Classical sources note that along with the elephants, the two rulers exchanged personal gifts. There's this record stating Chandragupta sent Seleucus various aphrodisiacs charms, supposedly designed to produce affection or banish love.
Right, which is just such a human, intimate detail inserted into this grand geopolitical chess match.
It really shows that these empires weren't just monolithic entities clashing. They were run by individuals engaged in active, continuous correspondence.
Absolutely. The Seleucids actually sent an ambassador named Megasthenes to live at Chandragupta's court in Pataliputra. And his written accounts became the primary lens through which the Western world understood South Asia for centuries.
Okay, so Chandragupta successfully secures these massive borders. But this brings us back to the fundamental problem of ancient governance. Conquering a territory that stretches from the Bay of Bengal to the mountains of Afghanistan is one thing. Actually holding it together, extracting taxes from it, and enforcing laws without telecommunications or motorized transport, that is a completely different logistical nightmare.
Yeah, and this is exactly where that traditional coloring book map of the empire misleads us. For decades, textbooks depicted the Maurya Empire as a solid block of direct imperial control.
Right.
But the sources, when read carefully alongside archaeological evidence, reveal a completely different administrative structure. The empire was broadly divided. The core region of Magadha, centered around the capital Pataliputra in the east, was ruled directly by the emperor.
But outside of that core,
Outside the core, the empire was divided into four massive outer provinces: Tasali in the east, Ujjain in the west, Suvarnagiri in the south, and Taxila in the northwest. And these provincial capitals were usually governed by royal princes acting as viceroys, providing this decentralized layer of royal authority.
and historians like Monica Smith, Herman Kolke, and Dietmar Rothermund have pushed forward what is called the network model to explain how this actually functioned on the ground.
Right.
If you imagine a modern airline's route map, you see major hub airports connected by distinct flight paths. The airline controls the hubs and the routes, but they have absolutely zero control over the vast stretches of wilderness or ocean beneath those flight paths. That is basically how the Mauryan Empire operated.
The hub-and-spoke analogy is perfect here. The Mauryan state did not have the manpower, the bureaucracy, or really the desire to administer every square inch of the subcontinent.
They just focus on the important parts.
Exactly. They focused their military and administrative power exclusively on the nodes, the major urban centers, mining districts, and agricultural hubs, and the arteries, the vital trade routes connecting them.
So, for instance, there was a crucial trade route known as the Uttara Path, a wintertime road that connected the northwestern territories in Afghanistan all the way down the Gangetic Plain to Pataliputra.
Right. Heavily trafficked during the winter when the massive rivers were low enough to ford.
And the Mauryan military priority was just keeping that road safe from bandits and ensuring goods could flow to the capital.
Yes. So the empire is essentially a skeletal network of heavily fortified urban centers and highways.
And sitting inside those empty spaces on the map, between the highways, were massive, dense forests populated by autonomous tribal groups and nomads.
Exactly.
If you were a hunter-gatherer living in a deep forest in central India, you might never see a Mauryan tax collector your entire life.
Probably not. The state interacted with those forest tribes pragmatically. If a tribe lived near a trade route, the state might bribe their leaders to act as guards or violently subjugate them if they disrupted trade.
But if they were deep in the wilderness, the state largely ignored them.
Mostly, yeah. And this network model is strongly supported by the archaeological record, specifically through the distribution of something called Northern Black Polished Ware, or NBPW.
I want to dig into that because NBPW sounds like a highly technical archaeological term, but it's actually a brilliant physical indicator of how the empire functioned. What exactly is it?
Northern Black Polished Ware is a very specific type of luxury pottery that emerged during this era. It's made from fine clay, fired at extremely high temperatures, and it has this distinct, brilliant, glossy black finish.
So it was likely used by the elite classes and merchants.
Exactly, highly prized. And when archaeologists map where they find shards of NBPW across South Asia, it doesn't blanket the continent evenly. It forms a distinct pattern.
Ah, I see where this is going.
Yeah, you find dense clusters of it in the major cities, the nodes, and you find it dotted along the major river and land routes, the arteries.
But in the vast regions between those routes,
It is completely absent. The pottery acts as a tracer die, physically illuminating the exact shape of the Mauryan trade and administrative network.
that is amazing. The luxury goods literally draw the map of the empire for us.
They really do.
And at the absolute center of this network was the capital city, Pataliputra. When the Greek ambassador Megasthenes arrived there, he was just astounded by the scale of it.
Oh, yeah. He described Pataliputra as a city built at the confluence of two massive rivers, surrounded by a wooden wall that featured 64 gates and 570 watchtowers.
570 watchtowers. That is incredible.
And the later Greek writer Abelian, working from Megasthenes' notes, stated that the royal palaces in Pataliputra were superior in splendor to the great Persian capitals of Susa and Ecbatana.
He described gilded pillars adorned with golden vines and silver birds.
Yeah, and building a wooden wall of that magnitude is a massive feat of civic engineering. Wood was chosen likely because stone was scarce in the alluvial plains of the Ganges, but maintaining a wooden palisade with nearly 600 towers requires a constant, highly organized supply of timber and labor.
It speaks to a state capable of intense resource mobilization.
Absolutely.
And the internal administration of Pataliputra was just as complex as its architecture. Megasthenes outlines a city council consisting of 30 commissioners, which was then subdivided into 6 highly specialized municipal boards.
Right.
There was a board responsible for fixing wages and supervising industrial arts. There was a board dedicated entirely to foreign dignitaries and tourists, ensuring they had lodging, monitoring their movements, and even returning their estates if they died while visiting.
Which is incredibly organized.
Yeah. There was a board for registering births and deaths, one for regulating manufactured goods, one for verifying weights and measures in the markets, and a final board dedicated strictly to collecting a 10% sales tax on everything sold.
When you hear that list, it sounds like the bureaucratic structure of a modern 21st century city.
It really does. But we have to ask the logistical question. How do you actually execute that in the Iron Age? How do you track the births and deaths of hundreds of thousands of citizens without paper, computers, or a modern postal service?
Well, it requires a massive delegation of authority through local intermediaries. The Mauryan state likely didn't have imperial bureaucrats knocking on every door. Instead, they relied heavily on existing social structures, specifically trade guilds and local neighborhood headmen.
Okay, so delegating to the community leaders.
Right. For the sales tax and rates and measures, they likely employed a system of toll gates. Goods coming into the city would be weighed, stamped, and taxed at the 64 city gates before they could even enter the market.
Makes sense. What about the census data?
For census data like births and deaths, local ward leaders would be responsible for maintaining oral records or using physical tally tokens, reporting those numbers up the chain to the municipal boards. The state leveraged the tight-knit nature of ancient urban communities to do the administrative heavy lifting.
And economically, the overarching philosophy of the state was incredibly centralized. Some historians have described it as a form of ancient state socialism or a socialized monarchy. Theoretically, the emperor owned all the land. The state controlled the major industries like mining and forestry.
Yes, and for the agricultural workers on state-owned land, the government provided the seeds, the draft animals, and the tools. In return, the state took a massive portion of the yield.
They also maintained immense public granaries, storing food specifically to distribute during times of famine or crisis.
But the state took on these vast welfare and infrastructural responsibilities, not necessarily out of altruism, but out of absolute necessity. The health of the agrarian economy directly funded the massive standing military. If the peasants starved, tax revenue collapsed, the military couldn't be paid, the trade routes would become unsafe, and the entire hub-and-spoke network would disintegrate.
Now, whenever we discuss the intricacies of Mauryan administration, espionage, and economics, we inevitably run into the Arthashastra.
Ah, yes.
This is a highly famous, incredibly detailed ancient manual on statecraft. Traditionally, history books attributed the authorship of this entire text directly to Chanakya, Chandragupta's brilliant minister.
Right. That was the long-held belief.
The text outlines a staggering level of state control. It details how to set up complex spy networks, how to regulate prostitution, how to manage state-owned textile workshops, and how to conduct covert warfare. For a long time, historians looked at the Arthashastra and said, this is exactly how Chandragupta ran his empire.
Yeah, but modern historical analysis has thrown a massive wrench into that assumption.
It absolutely has. The traditional view of the Arthashastra as a first-hand, literal account of Mauryan governance has been largely dismantled.
Completely. Through intense textual analysis, linguistics, and statistical studies of the text's composition, modern scholars have concluded that the Arthashastra was not written by a single man in 300 BCE.
Right. Instead, it is a composite text. It was compiled, edited, and expanded upon by multiple authors over several centuries, with the final major redactions likely happening somewhere between 50 CE and 300 CE.
Which means the final version of the text we are reading was put together hundreds of years after the Maurya Empire had already collapsed.
So why do historians still discuss it in the context of the Maurya?
Because while the final compilation is late, it undeniably contains older layers of political thought, some of which likely trace back to the Mauryan era. However, we really have to change how we read it.
How so?
The Arthashastra is a prescriptive text, not a descriptive one. It is a theoretical treatise on how a perfect, brutally efficient state should be run in a utopian scenario.
So it's not a historical record of how the Mauryas actually ran things on a random Tuesday.
Exactly. If we project the totalitarian, micromanaged perfection of the Arthashastra onto the reality of the Mauryan Empire, we ignore the messy, decentralized, network-based reality of the archaeological evidence.
That distinction between theoretical perfection and historical reality is vital.
Very much so.
Moving forward in the timeline, Chandragupta eventually steps down, leaving this vast, hub-and-spoke network to the second generation. His son, Bindusara, takes the throne around 297 BCE.
And Bindusara inherits a highly functional northern and central empire, and he uses that stability to look southward.
The sources credit Bindusara with massive territorial expansion deep into the Deccan Plateau, pushing the empire's borders all the way down into modern Karnataka.
The southern expansion is a logistical marvel. Bindusara extended Mauryan authority across the peninsula, essentially bringing the land between the Bay of Bengal and the Arabian Sea under his umbrella.
The texts say he conquered 16 states in the process.
We should clarify what conquest means in this context, though.
Right, it likely wasn't direct micromanaged administration.
No, Bindusara was establishing suzerainty over these states. Suzerainty means the local rulers were allowed to remain in power and run their own internal affairs, but they had to acknowledge the Mauryan emperor as their supreme overlord, pay regular tribute, and provide military support if requested.
It's a much cheaper way to expand an empire than trying to install your own governors everywhere.
Absolutely.
But there is a geographic anomaly in Bindusara's conquest. He pushed his armies deep into the south, but he stopped right before the absolute southern tip of the peninsula. He established friendly diplomatic relations with the extreme southern Tamil kingdoms, the Cholas, the Pandyas, and the Cheras.
Right.
If you have the military momentum to conquer 16 states, why stop at the border of the last three?
It comes right back to the economics of the network model. The primary goal of the southern expansion wasn't just coloring in the map, it was securing access to specific resources, particularly the gold and iron mines located in Suvarnagiri, which literally translates to Golden Mountain.
Oh, wow. Golden Mountain.
Yeah, and once Bindusara secured the resource nodes and the trade routes leading to them, the calculus of war changed.
Launching a massive military invasion into the fiercely independent Tamil kingdoms at the absolute maximum edge of your supply lines is incredibly risky and expensive.
Exactly. It was far more profitable to maintain those Tamil kingdoms as independent, friendly trading partners. They could funnel the maritime trade from the Indian Ocean up into the Mauryan network without the Mauryan state having to pay to occupy them.
That is smart. And Bindusara was highly adept at managing international relationships, not just in the south, but globally. He maintained the deep diplomatic ties his father established with the Hellenistic world.
He did. He hosted a new Greek ambassador, Deimachus, who was sent by the Seleucid king Antiochus I.
And this diplomatic relationship produced one of my absolute favorite anecdotes from antiquity, preserved by the Greek writer Athenaeus.
Oh, the letter. This is great.
Yes. According to the record, Bindusara wrote a letter to King Antiochus I. In it, the ruler of the Indian subcontinent asks the Hellenistic king to sell him 3 specific items: sweet wine, dried figs, and a Greek sophist, a philosopher.
And Antiochus writes back, agreeing to send the figs and the wine, but politely declining the third request, stating that it was not lawful in Greece to sell a philosopher.
It's just so funny. I want to analyze this because on the surface, it sounds like an ancient billionaire trying to import a rare luxury item to show off at a dinner party.
Yeah.
What does it mean for an emperor to try and buy a philosopher? Does this indicate genuine intellectual curiosity, or was philosophy just another exotic commodity?
It reveals a lot about the cultural economy of the ancient world. In Hellenistic courts, philosophers, poets, and scientists were highly prized assets. Kings would sponsor them, essentially buying their presence, to elevate the prestige of their court.
A court buzzing with intellectual debate projected wealth and sophistication.
Right. Bindusara asking to purchase a sophist shows he was tapped into this Hellenistic cultural economy. But it also reflects his genuine documented interest in diverse philosophies. Bindusara was known to be highly pluralistic in his religious patronage.
While his father leaned toward Jainism, Bindusara was a patron of the Ajivika religion, keeping an Ajivika guru in his royal court.
And the Ajivika movement is fascinating and quite distinct from what we usually associate with Indian philosophy today.
They were an ascetic movement, right?
Yes, but their defining feature was a strict belief in absolute determinism. They believed that everything in the universe, every human action, was entirely preordained by cosmic principles and that free will was an absolute illusion.
That is a very stark, fatalistic worldview to have floating around the vibrant, multi-religious court of an expanding empire.
It really is.
So, Bindusara expands the empire to its maximum geographic and diplomatic limits, setting a massive stage. And this brings us to his son, Ashoka, who takes the throne around 268 BCE. Ashoka is going to inherit this vast machinery of war and trade, discover its horrific human limitations, and radically reinvent the ideological operating system of the state.
Ashoka is arguably one of the most complex and heavily scrutinized figures in world history. Our perception of him is heavily colored by his later life, but it is crucial to understand that he did not start out as a pacifist.
The Buddhist sources, while prone to exaggeration to emphasize his later conversion, paint young Ashoka as a ruthless and highly capable prince.
Yeah, as a viceroy stationed in Ujjain, he brutally suppressed provincial revolts. When his father died, there was a vicious war of succession, which Ashoka won by violently eliminating his rivals.
He was a product of a heavily militarized, expansionist dynasty, and his early reign reflected that. The pivot point of his life, and arguably the entire trajectory of South Asian history, occurs in 261 BCE. Ashoka decides to conquer Kalinga, which corresponds to modern-day Odisha on the eastern coast.
And geographically, Kalinga was a glaring anomaly. It was a wealthy, independent kingdom sitting right on the eastern seaboard, controlling highly lucrative maritime trade routes, and it was completely surrounded by Mauryan territory.
His father and grandfather hadn't conquered it, likely because it had a massive entrenched military. But Ashoka decided to close the gap.
And the resulting Kalinga War was an absolute bloodbath. We know this not from later myths, but from Ashoka's own public confessions carved into stone.
The numbers Ashoka presents in his edicts are staggering for the Iron Age. He states that 100,000 soldiers and civilians were killed in the fighting, and 150,000 people were deported or enslaved.
Even the victorious Mauryan army suffered heavy losses, with estimates of over 10,000 soldiers dead.
We really have to pause and consider the logistics of that destruction. To kill 100,000 people with swords, spears, and elephants is a slow, intimately visceral process.
And the disease and starvation that follow an invasion of that scale, destroying the agricultural base of an entire region, it would have multiplied the suffering exponentially.
And Ashoka actually toured the battlefield after the victory. He witnessed the rotting corpses, the mass deportations, their shattered families, and it completely broke him.
The edicts describe him feeling profound, crushing remorse. He realizes that conquering an independent country essentially involves the slaughter, death, and deportation of the innocent.
In response to this trauma, he renounces aggressive warfare. He embraces the teachings of Buddhism, pivoting from a warlord to a patron of peace.
But Ashoka doesn't just retreat to a monastery. He takes this personal spiritual awakening and weaponizes it for statecraft.
He translates his new moral compass into a universal public policy that he calls Dhamma.
Right. And Dhamma, derived from the Sanskrit dharma, is a difficult word to translate directly. In Ashoka's political context, it didn't mean strict adherence to Buddhist theology.
It was more like a broader civic religion.
Yes. It meant piety, social responsibility, respect for elders, humane treatment of servants, and most importantly, nonviolent toward living creatures.
It was a brilliantly accessible, ethical framework designed to unify a massively diverse population under a single moral umbrella, regardless of their specific local deities.
Exactly. And he broadcast this new policy in the most permanent, unavoidable way possible: the Edicts of Ashoka.
He had these proclamations of Dhamma carved into sheer rock faces and massive, highly polished stone pillars erected all across the subcontinent.
But if we look at this through the lens of the network model we discussed earlier, the placement of these edicts is a masterclass in ancient propaganda. He didn't just place them randomly in the deep forests.
Right. The geographic distribution of the edicts perfectly traces the arterial trade routes and the major urban nodes of the empire. He placed them at border crossings, at pilgrimage sites, and in the bustling provincial capitals.
Now, a common question is, who was actually reading these? The literacy rate in the ancient world was incredibly low. The average peasant walking past a stone pillar couldn't read the Prakrit language inscribed on it.
So how did it work?
The edicts were designed to be read aloud by state officials and local administrators during public gatherings and festivals. The physical pillar itself, often topped with a magnificent animal capital, served as a permanent symbol of imperial authority, while the spoken words delivered the ideological software of the state.
He was essentially building an ideological highway system. He wanted to project moral authority into the provinces without having to pay for a massive standing army to garrison every city.
Exactly.
And he was remarkably adaptable in how he communicated this. There is a specific rock edict located in Kandahar, in modern Afghanistan, that perfectly illustrates his pluralistic approach. The Kandahar edict is bilingual, written in Aramaic, and excellent classical Greek.
Yeah, that one is amazing.
When Ashoka addresses his Greek-speaking subjects, who are likely descendants of Alexander's colonists or Hellenistic merchants, he doesn't just force an Indian word onto them. He conceptually translates Dhamma into the Greek philosophical term eusebia, which translates to piety or reverence toward the gods and societal duties.
It is a profound act of linguistic and philosophical diplomacy. He is speaking to his Greek subjects utilizing their own cultural framework.
Right.
He is telling them, in the language of Plato and Aristotle, that the king has achieved eusebia by abstaining from killing living beings, and he asks them to live better, more restrained lives. It proves the Mauryan Empire wasn't a monoculture. It was a deeply integrated cosmopolitan space.
And Ashoka didn't just preach morality, he funded it. His edicts proudly announced that he established massive medical networks. He created treatment centers not just for humans, but for animals as well.
He actively imported medicinal herbs and roots, planting them along the trade routes, along with banyan trees to provide shade for travelers, and digging wells at regular intervals.
But this massive pivot from militarism to pacifist welfare sparks one of the biggest historiographical debates regarding the Mauryas. What were his true motives, and did this pivot ultimately destroy the empire?
Yeah, that's the big question.
Some early 20th century historians, like Hemchandra Raichaudhuri, argued that Ashoka's obsessive pacifism critically weakened the military backbone of the empire, leaving it vulnerable to the invasions that followed his death.
But more contemporary historians like Ramla Thapar argue that we shouldn't take Ashoka's claims of total nonviolence at face value.
I want to dive into this debate. Was Ashoka a genuinely awakened pacifist who accidentally ruined his military, or was he a highly pragmatic ruler who realized the empire had reached its absolute logistical limits and decided to use peace as a cheap way to govern a tapped-out state?
Ramla Thapar's analysis is highly persuasive here. We don't have to doubt the genuine personal trauma Ashoka felt after Kalinga, nor the sincerity of his Buddhist faith. However, emperors operate in the realm of pragmatism. Thapar points out that despite all the rhetoric of nonviolence, Ashoka never disbanded the imperial army. He never abolished the death penalty. In his edicts aimed at the unruly forest tribes, he explicitly warns them that while he feels remorse, he still possesses the power to punish them if they don't conform.
So he still had the stick, even if he was offering a carrot.
Exactly. The Mauryan state had reached its geographic maximum. Expanding further south or further west would cost more in military logistics than it would yield in taxes. Furthermore, suppressing rebellions across such a vast network using pure military force was economically unsustainable.
So Dhamma was a pragmatic solution.
Yes. It replaced the expensive, coercive power of a constantly mobilized military with the persuasive, soft power of a shared civic religion. It was brilliant statesmanship disguised as pure spiritual guidance.
That soft power was operating alongside a massive societal and economic earthquake happening across South Asia. Ashoka's personal pivot to Buddhism was highly visible, but it was just one symptom of a much broader shift in how the 15 to 30 million people living in the empire were changing their daily lives.
Yeah, religion and society were fundamentally shifting.
During this era, we see a significant shift away from the traditional dominance of Vedic Brahmanism. Brahmanism was the established religious order, heavily reliant on a strict caste hierarchy and complex, highly expensive animal sacrifices performed exclusively by Brahmin priests.
But as the Mauryan economy boomed and urbanization accelerated, new philosophical movements, known broadly as the Srama movements, began to gain massive popularity.
The Sramana movements, which include Buddhism, Jainism, and the Ajivikas, were essentially ascetic renunciant traditions.
They fundamentally rejected the authority of the Vedas, they rejected the strict caste monopolies of the Brahmins, and they focused on individual spiritual liberation through meditation, ethical living, and nonviolence.
And crucially, these Sramana movements received massive financial backing from a newly empowered social class, the merchants.
Right. As the Mauryas secured the trade routes and introduced standardized silver punch-marked coinage, long-distance trade just exploded.
A new, wealthy class of urban merchants and guild leaders emerged, and these merchants overwhelmingly threw their financial support behind Buddhism and Jainism, effectively sidelining the traditional Brahmanical priests.
Which begs the question, why did the merchants prefer these new ascetic religions?
It comes down to a perfect alignment of ethics and economics, doesn't it?
It really does. The traditional Vedic sacrifices required the slaughter of vast numbers of cattle and livestock. For an agricultural and mercantile economy, cattle are capital. They are draft animals, dairy producers, and transport.
So the continuous slaughter of these animals for religious rituals was a massive drain on the economy.
Exactly. The Sramana religions promoted ahimsa, or nonviolence. They protected the cattle. Furthermore, they frowned upon ostentatious displays of wealth and promoted a frugal, disciplined lifestyle.
Which makes sense for a merchant.
Yes, for a merchant trying to accumulate capital and reinvest it in trade, a religion that says, don't waste your wealth on massive sacrifices, live simply and be honest in your transactions, is the perfect ideological fit. The ethics of Buddhism and Jainism reduced the friction and cost of doing business.
The alignment there is fascinating. It reminds me of how modern massive corporations often back green energy initiatives. Yes, there is a stated moral component about saving the earth, but fundamentally, transitioning to renewables disrupts old, expensive fossil fuel monopolies that cut into their long-term profits.
That's a great comparison. The ancient merchants backed the religions that structurally supported their accumulation of wealth.
And the state, which desperately needed to tax that mercantile wealth to survive, naturally began heavily patronizing those same religions, creating a symbiotic loop between commerce, the Sramana faiths, and the imperial court.
Exactly.
Now, speaking of saving the earth, Ashoka's reign features what some environmental historians have eagerly categorized as the world's first state-sponsored conservation laws.
Yes, the edicts again.
In his edicts, Ashoka explicitly bans the royal hunt, which was a traditional pastime for kings. He restricts the slaughter of various specific animals, and he creates strict rules against burning forests without a specific justifiable reason. On paper, Ashoka looks like an ancient pioneer of wildlife conservation.
But again, when we peel back the moral rhetoric, there is a deeply practical military-industrial reason for the state to protect the forests.
Right, because while Ashoka's Buddhist compassion for living beings was likely a factor, the Mauryan state apparatus viewed the forests through a strictly strategic lens.
Yes. The forests were not just empty wilderness, they were the exclusive breeding ground for the state's most critical military asset, the elephant.
As we discussed with Seleucus, elephants were the heavy armor of the ancient world.
And breeding elephants in captivity is notoriously difficult, incredibly slow, and massively expensive due to the sheer volume of food they consume.
So it was vastly more efficient for the state to let the elephants live and breed naturally in the wild, and then trap and train adult elephants as needed.
Therefore, protecting the forests from being burned down by expanding agricultural settlements meant protecting the military supply chain.
And while those conservation edicts look incredibly progressive, carved into stone pillars, the reality on the ground was far messier. The sources note that peasants and the autonomous forest tribes often completely ignored these laws.
Because if you are a subsistence farmer living on the edge of a forest, you have to hunt, fish, and clear land just to survive. You can't afford to care about the emperor's spiritual awakening if a wild elephant is trampling your crops.
Exactly. The state generally viewed these forest tribes with deep suspicion. Because they lived outside the agrarian tax system, they were seen as untrustworthy. The state managed them pragmatically, sometimes employing them as border guards or specialized animal trappers, but frequently threatening them if they disrupted the all-important trade routes.
It was a very tense relationship.
And this brings us to a really difficult paradox in Mauryan society. While the state was officially becoming more moral and protective toward animals, the human rights for specific marginalized groups were actually deteriorating.
Yeah, that's a sad reality of this period.
As the economy boomed and the caste system began to consolidate more rigidly in the core Gangetic plains, tribal peoples were increasingly absorbed into the lowest, most despised ranks of society. Furthermore, the rights of women in the mainstream Indo-Aryan speaking regions took a massive hit during this period of urbanization.
If we look at the Arthashastra, despite it being a later compilation, it reflects social attitudes that were hardening. It explicitly outlines strict controls over female behavior, prioritizing their role in producing male heirs above all else.
How do we reconcile this paradox? The court achieves this incredible moral enlightenment, but the status of women and tribal groups simultaneously degrades.
It is a sobering reminder that historical progress is almost never linear, and it is rarely universal. Economic booms and urbanization often produce highly contradictory social outcomes.
That makes sense.
The wealth that funded the beautiful Buddhist monasteries and the massive trade networks was generated by an increasingly complex, property-based agrarian society. As land and wealth became more concentrated in the hands of elite families, controlling the inheritance of that property became paramount.
I see.
And in patriarchal societies, the mechanism for controlling inheritance is controlling women in marriage. This era sees the embedding of stricter patriarchal customs, lowering the age of marriage for women to ensure virginity and clear paternity, and stripping women of agency outside the domestic sphere.
So the moral philosophical enlightenment discussed by the monks and the emperor in Pataliputra simply did not translate into social equity for women or marginalized tribes laboring in the agricultural core.
Exactly. It's a stark contrast.
It really is a reminder to always look past the monuments to see how the average person was actually living. Now, to cap off the intense religious and philosophical fervor of this entire era, we actually have to look backward to the founder of the dynasty, Chandragupta.
Right, his ending is quite something.
According to a much later Jain text from the 12th century, Chandragupta's life ends in a highly dramatic spiritual fashion. The text claims that a massive 12-year famine hit the empire. In response, Chandragupta abdicated his throne, gave up all his immense wealth and power, and joined a group of wandering Jain monks.
He supposedly traveled deep into southern India to a place called Shravana-Belgola, and there he observed Santhara, the rigorous, ultimate Jain ritual of systematically fasting to death in pursuit of spiritual purity and liberation from the physical world.
It is a phenomenal narrative arc. You have a man who utilized ruthless military strategy and opportunism to violently forge one of the largest empires in human history, and he ends his life by voluntarily starving himself in a cave, possessing absolutely nothing.
Now, historians constantly debate the veracity of this text. It was written over 1,000 years after his death, and some scholars suggest it might actually refer to a later descendant rather than Chandragupta himself.
That makes sense to question it.
However, historically true or not, the story perfectly encapsulates the specific cultural atmosphere of the Mauryan era. In this society, the ultimate display of absolute power was not conquering a city. It was possessing the spiritual discipline to voluntarily renounce that power.
Despite all of this incredible synthesis, the sprawling trade routes, the civic welfare, the intricate diplomacy, and the profound moral philosophies, the Mauryan Empire eventually unravels. The network falls apart. How does a system this sophisticated collapse so quickly?
The decline was remarkably rapid. After Ashoka died around 232 BCE, the structural flaws of the network model were violently exposed.
Right, because he was followed by a succession of much weaker, less capable emperors.
The empire was almost immediately partitioned into eastern and western halves. They began losing the peripheral territories as local viceroys declared independence.
So the fatal flaw of the Mauryan state was its hyper-centralization of authority.
Exactly. The entire hub-and-spoke system relied almost entirely on the personal charisma, competence, and terrifying reputation of the emperor sitting in the center at Pataliputra. There was no deep national consciousness, binding a Tamil merchant, a Greek farmer in Bactria, and an agrarian peasant in the Ganges plain together.
They were held together by the immediate economic benefits of trade and the threat of the Mauryan army.
Right. And once the center weakened and the army couldn't project power, the spokes of the network naturally detached. The local governors simply stopped sending taxes to Pataliputra.
And the final fatal blow comes in 180 BCE. It is a scene straight out of a political thriller.
It really is.
The last Mauryan emperor, a man named Brihadratha, is inspecting his troops during a public military parade. And right there, in front of the entire army, he is assassinated by his own commander-in-chief, a general named Pushyamitra Shunga.
The general seizes the throne and establishes the Shunga dynasty, officially ending the Mauryan line.
The tragic irony of that moment is palpable. An empire that reached its absolute zenith under Ashoka's massive stone banners of nonviolence, and Dhamma ends just 50 years later with its final emperor bleeding out in the dust at a military parade, murdered by the very institution Ashoka tried to philosophically suppress.
It perfectly illustrates that ideology rarely survives systemic weakness. And this internal collapse had immediate, devastating external consequences.
With the Mauryan central command occupied by assassinations and civil war, the vital northwestern frontier, the Khyber Pass, was left completely unguarded.
And over in Bactria, which is modern-day northern Afghanistan, a Hellenistic king named Demetrius saw the opportunity. He swept through the unguarded mountain passes and invaded, establishing the Indo-Greek kingdom in the region.
The territories that Chandragupta had brilliantly secured with 500 elephants were lost, and a new wave of Hellenistic political influence washed back into South Asia.
But while the political state collapsed, the cultural and ideological legacy of the Mauryas endured, and it fundamentally shaped the modern world.
Yes. Ashoka's sponsorship of Buddhist missionaries, sending embassies to Sri Lanka, to the Hellenistic kings in Egypt and Syria, and into Central Asia, was the catalyst that transformed Buddhism from a regional Indian philosophical sect into a massive global world religion.
And you can literally see the visual legacy of the Mauryas today. When India gained its independence in 1947, the founders of the new republic needed visual symbols to represent their ancient heritage and their modern aspirations.
They bypassed the medieval kings and the colonial eras, and they looked straight back to Ashoka.
They chose the lion capital of Ashoka, excavated from Sarnath, as the official state emblem of India.
And if you look at the modern Indian flag, sitting right in the white center band is a 24-spoked navy blue wheel. That is the Ashoka Chakra, the Wheel of Dharma, taken directly from his ancient pillars.
It is a stunning testament to the enduring power of Ashoka's ideological vision. Over 2 millennia after the wooden walls of Pataliputra rotted away, a massive, modern democratic republic looked back to an Iron Age autocrat to find its foundational symbols of justice, morality, and unity.
What an incredible journey. Let's quickly recap what we've explored today. We started with a massive power vacuum left by a mutinying Macedonian army, which Chandragupta Maurya and his strategist Chanakya filled through a mix of grassroots rebellion and ruthless military consolidation.
We dismantled the map, seeing how they built a hub-and-spoke network of trade routes and heavily fortified cities rather than a solid block of territory.
We explored Bindusara's cosmopolitan diplomacy, balancing southern tribute with Hellenistic philosophical exchanges. And finally, we witnessed Ashoka's crucible at Kalinga, which led to an unprecedented attempt to govern a vast multilingual population through the moral framework of Dhamma, leaving a legacy of religious transformation that outlasted the empire's rapid, violent collapse.
It's a lot to process.
It is. And I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over as you go about your day. We talked extensively about the Arthashastra, that brilliant manual detailing the perfect, flawlessly efficient, heavily micromanaged state bureaucracy. We base so much of our popular understanding of ancient Indian administration on that text.
But as we learned, that text was heavily edited and compiled for centuries after the Maurya Empire fell.
It makes you wonder, how much of the perfect administration, the intricate spy networks, and the flawless tax boards we associate with the Mauryas is historical fact? And how much of it is just the ancient equivalent of historical fiction? Was it written by later generations of scholars trapped in fractured, chaotic kingdoms, dreaming of a golden age of centralized order that never actually existed in the way they imagined?
It really reframes everything.
It proves that a historical coloring book we talked about at the start, the rigid lines and the solid borders, they were drawn in long after the ink of history was dry. Keep digging, keep questioning those maps, and keep looking for the messy human reality beneath the stone monuments. We will see you next time on The Deep Dive.